15th, 2003. We were interviewing Colonel Norman D. Stuckey at his home on Upper Valley Pike, or Lower Valley Pike. And go ahead and give me your name, sir.
I'm Colonel Norman Stuckey. I've been asked for this interview for the Library of Congress archives. I was an Iowa farm boy. I was born in 1919, April 26th, and raised on the farm, and never any of my family had ever been in the military. So as World War II approached, it was a new event for our family. Not wanting to carry a gun and be in the Army, I talked to some friends, and so I learned about Chanute Field, Illinois, where they were training airplane mechanics, and so I went over there and joined the Army, and so joined my Army Air Corps, and attended mechanic school. After finishing mechanic school then, a year later, they transferred me to Hickam Field, Hawaii, where I engaged in working on airplanes. It was a lovely place to be stationed. The weather was good, and we had lots of activity, and except that there were no girls around. So we fellows would try to entertain ourselves by deep sea fishing and snorkeling and things around there. And of course on payday we would always go into Honolulu to enjoy ourselves there. Most of the time the fellows, though, when they were off duty, would get a truck, which was permissible, and a bunch of fellows, and go by the mess hall and get food, sandwich, meat, and so forth. And then we'd go out on the beach, build a bonfire, and have a cookout and fish. That was the recreation for the Air Corps military enlisted men at that time. The officers at Hickam Field had their wives there, and they had a different lifestyle than the enlisted people, which were mostly at that time single. We were surprised on December the 7th when we heard these roar of airplanes overhead and heard these booms off over Pearl Harbor, which was just across the fence from my barracks at Hickam Field. We couldn't imagine what was going on. We thought that the Navy was having a sham battle, as the fellows did once in a while on Sunday morning. Two of us climbed up on the barracks to get a better look at Pearl Harbor, and we could see the big geysers of water shooting up from the ships over there, hear the blasts of the bombs and so forth, and it wasn't long before we thought something was really wrong. About that time, sitting on top of the barracks, we saw these Japanese fighters swoop across the top of our barracks, and we saw the big red circles on the sides of the airplanes, and we realized right off that they were Japanese. Well, it didn't take us long to get down off the barracks. On the first mission, first air wave of airplanes from Japan, they concentrated on the ships at Pearl Harbor with torpedoes and bombs and strafing. But it was the second wave of airplanes that started to work on the airfields and work at Schofield Barracks, Wheeler Field, and Fort Shafter and Hickam. And at that time was when the bombs started falling on our hangars, and they started to bomb the barracks, and they disrupted our activities by that. And we were quite busy at that time because some of the fellows were being wounded, and we had to carry them over to the base hospital. And surprising enough, the base hospital was never touched. So I guess the Japanese knew that it was a hospital. However, they did a good job on all the other buildings around. And the attack on Pearl Harbor did not last very long, and I believe it was about an hour and a half. And at that time, during the attack, I got onto a truck and headed up to, I believe, above Pearl Harbor, where it was thought maybe the local Japanese might sabotage a big well up there. It was used by the Navy and also used by the sugar cane company for watering purposes. And we were to guard that well from the local Japanese. Well, while we were there, there was a wreckage of a Japanese plane right nearby with 2 burned bodies in it. And I went down and cut a piece of the aluminum off of it and made a V for victory, which I brought back to the States with me. Well, after Pearl Harbor, I was most anxious to come back to the States, and so the only way that I could get back was to put in for cadets.
Wait a minute. Before you came back to the States, though, can you tell me what you were doing that morning? What had you just done when you saw the attack start?
Well, during the day on Sunday, 2 or 3 of us were busy helping the few that were hit with shrapnel.
Yeah.
And when they bombed the barracks, they were hurt other ways, and so we helped them to the hospital.
Sure.
Which was right there on Hickam Field, and that's what we were doing.
What was it like in there?
Beg pardon?
What was it like inside the hospital?
Well, of course, a lot of people were hurrying around because there was no notice that there was an attack coming.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say at this time that before Pearl Harbor, about every week or two, they'd ring the bell, blow the whistles, and we'd go run to our appointed places, put on our helmets, grab our guns, and be ready for any eventuality. But on December the 7th, no one rang the bell or blew the whistle, so there was just pandemonium as people just did what they thought they should be doing at that time.
Now, hadn't you just gone to breakfast that morning?
Yes, I had. I was one of the 2 of us were a few that went for breakfast, because breakfast was over at 8 o'clock,
Mm-hmm.
and we'd gone over to eat, and I'd come back to the barracks, and I'd been back to the barracks just a few minutes when the attack came. But you can imagine that when the attack came, the fellows were sleeping, and with all the noise, they become restless and growling and cussing the Navy pilots for making all the noise.
Now,
And so that's what took place at that time.
What's that sham battle you talked about? What's
That
that?
was a sham battle we thought was going on, but it wasn't.
What is that? It's a sham battle is a mock drill.
Yes, a sham battle, that was our term for a mock battle, see. Now and then the Admiral would get the Navy pilots out. They'd run out to their auxiliary airfields, jump in these fighter planes and go buzzing around the island, see, diving and doing different things like that and playing more. But and so that's what we thought was going on December the 7th.
Now, you said before that the thing that separates Hickam and Pearl is what?
We just have a fence between them. And there was a gate, you could just go and come through the gate and go over to Pearl Harbor. And sitting on the fence, up on top of the barracks like we did that day, we could look down across the fences and look right over at Pearl Harbor and see what was going on.
And did you see any specific ships getting bombed? Or?
Well, as an Army Air Corps person, I didn't know the names of the ships very good.
Mm-hmm.
And they were just battleships and I guess cruisers and auxiliary ships were in the harbor. And those were the ones the Japanese were concentrating on with torpedoes and bombs.
How many planes did you see that were Japanese planes attacking? Could you count them, or did it seem like a lot number, or could you tell?
Well, looking down, we sat there on the roof just a very few minutes after we realized there's a war going on, and those were Japanese planes, and they were bombing. We could see them bombing, and the big geysers of water shooting up in the air, see? And we could hear the noise and see all that. And so we quickly got down off the barracks. And of course, when you're down off the barracks, you don't look down on Pearl Harbor anymore.
Sure.
So, because of all the shrubbery.
Now, did you go to the airfield and help out there also before you went to the hospital?
Well, we did different things. We ran here and there with water, but then
Now, tell me about that.
they came by with the truck and they wanted 2 or 3 of us to go up to Aliyah to guard this pump.
Now, tell me what happened before you went. You did take some water somewhere. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, we had to carry some water here and there, but
Was it to put out a fire?
most of the time we were just hurrying here and there to see what had to be done, what we could do
Sure.
without direction.
Yes.
Because it was Sunday morning, all the high-ranking officers, all the high-ranking enlisted men were not around.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a sidearm then?
No, we did not have a sidearm on, no.
Okay. And what did you think when you saw the Japanese were attacking?
Well, it was very difficult for us to believe, because we wouldn't think that any country would dare attack the United States. And so we were very surprised, and it was hard to believe that that was happening. Really,
mm-hmm.
It's hard to. We just couldn't understand what was going on, really.
Yep.
And as privates and PFCs and corporals that we were not knowledgeable about any of the war plans or, familiar with anything going on.
Sure.
And as a military person, we didn't pay much attention to politics either, see.
Now, so you were an airplane mechanic before Pearl Harbor happened, and you had a story about a gentleman used to drive around for a while.
Soon after Pearl Harbor, I came back down after guarding the well for a while, and I was assigned the duty to drive a tech sergeant around in a command car. And these cars were high four-wheel drive, like a truck gear and all that, with no doors on them, and a canvas top. And so I drove him around. He was in the communications, a tall, handsome, gray-haired man. So I'd drive him up to Fort Shafter, and we'd drive around Palm Circle there, where they have these real large homes for the officers. And the officers would be walking maybe down the street, and they'd holler out, "Hey, Charlie, how are you?" And he'd holler, "Hey, Bill, how are you?" Here they were colonels, you see, and he was a tech sergeant. And I thought that was kind of strange, being a PFC at that time. So, but I drove him around then, and a few, wherever he needed to go, up in the mountains to the command center, or down on the base, or to the Army, to the Navy, wherever, I drove him. And one day he came out from his quarters as a brigadier general. I just couldn't believe that. A BG, he climbed in, but in World War I, he was a full colonel in communications. And as a tech sergeant, he was in charge of communications for that area. Mm-hmm. But he was called back to active duty as a BG, see, and he took over communications for the Pacific, I understand. But that was quite a shock to me. But he looked the part. He was a handsome man, and gray-haired, and had been in World War I. But but after he became BG, well, I didn't drive him, but I think 1 or 2 days longer.
Mm-hmm. Now, so it was a big transition for you, going from Iowa farm boy, and you're from Centerville, Iowa, to Pearl Harbor in just a few. Now, the local paper put your picture in the paper, didn't they?
Yes, I sent a picture back showing me dressed up in Hawaii with a tin hat, you see, and a gas mask, and all that, dressed for battle. Mm-hmm. But that's the way we were when we practiced waiting for the enemy when they blew the whistle and ring the bells.
And that was a big transition, though. I mean, you went from farming to fighting the Japs right away.
Well, it was a big transition for me because none of my family had ever been in the service. They were all farmers, and so they were excused from military duty. And so there was nobody in my family on either side that was ever in the service. I had a great uncle. It was drafted for the Civil War. And at that time, you could hire somebody that wasn't drafted to go in your place. So he paid this young man $1,000 to go to the Civil War for him. And the young man went to the war and returned.
What was his name?
I forgot.
Okay, but that's a funny story.
Well, I think that quite a number of men hired somebody to go in their place during the Civil War.
Sure. Now, so after Pearl Harbor happens, you went to Ilea, came back, and you wanted to get off the island because there was nothing to do there, and you got bored with it. So what prompted you to want to become a pilot?
Well, I liked the work I was doing. I liked the weather, but there's no girls. Mm-hmm. So it was a terrible situation for a young fella not to be able to even talk to a young girl. And so the only way to back to the States was to put in for cadets. I know the fellows tried all manners of ways to get back to the States. They couldn't. But put in for cadets, you could pass the test, you could come back to the States.
What did some guys try to get back? I mean, they tried to act crazy and sort of things?
Yes, they did. Some of them act like a kind of goofy. This friend of mine, Charlie Shea, was born with flat feet. And he said, boy, I just can't hardly walk. He was in the hospital, you know, and they examined his feet. But they wouldn't let him come back. But they, I guess, sympathized with him. But you know, a strange thing happened. Charlie came back on the boat with me as a cadet. We went through cadets together.
Yeah.
And he became a B-52 pilot like I did.
They wouldn't kick him out because they let him in the service with flat feet, right?
He could walk fine. He could run fine. He could do anything fine, even with his flat feet.
So where did you go to when you? How did you get selected? Was there a selection process that was hard
For cadets,
to be cadet? Yeah.
you put in for it, and then you passed a series of tests and a physical.
Okay.
And I passed the tests.
And there was.
And you see, I only had 1 year of college.
Yeah.
And I think at that time you had to have quite a bit of college to become an officer. But I guess they waived that, and so I came back to the States, to the West Coast Training Center, and entered cadets at Santa Ana, California. And of course that was a place that was filled with thousands of young men entering a cadet program. And it was a good place because we had a lot of Hollywood talent out there putting on shows, and the Hollywood people would invite several of us into Hollywood for parties, and there was a good time for all of us when we weren't training. But the training program was very vigorous and demanding, and but as a farm boy, I guess I was used to hard work, and so I didn't mind it.
Sure.
It was interesting to me, though, the number of washouts that we had.
Yeah.
And then I moved on in to Fort Stockton, Texas for primary, where I flew Stearmans. And I thought I was the world's worst pilot, but it seemed like every day I'd go back to the barracks after training, and it'd be 1 or 2 empty bunks the fellas had washed out. And even the day before, they'd brag about doing loops and things that, you know, I'd even tried to do. And so I figured that they were awful smart people, but they got washed out. Let's shut her off. I was at Fort Stockton, Texas there in primary, and flying these Stearman airplanes, which I think was probably the hardest airplane I ever did fly, because they seemed to have a built-in ground loop, and it was just difficult to land them, whereas other airplanes are a lot easier to land. I was in training there for 3 months, and I thought that things were going pretty bad, but however I progressed along. And one day I was down on the flight line, and I run into a fellow called Darrell Whistler from my hometown. He was a farm boy, and he'd had some flight training, and he was a civilian instructor. And he says, come on, I want to give you a ride in an airplane. So I grabbed my chute and climbed in with him, and we talked about the family back home as we walked to the airplane and so forth. And we got in this Stearman, and he took me out in the country and buzzed windmills and just scared the daylights out of me. I just had never been in such a situation before where I was scared like I was that day. Well, he brought me back, and we landed, and I soloed, and I progressed on down to basic training at Pecos, Texas. There we flew VT-13s, the Volt-T vibrator they called them, and they were an all-aluminum airplane. And but we were forewarned, now you got to watch this airplane, and when you come in for a final turn to land, don't pull that stick back and pull the nose up, or it'll loop on you and auger into the ground. That means corkscrew right down into the ground. In our class there were 4 flight officers, And they went out to the auxiliary field one day after we'd been in training a short time. And these lieutenants kind of set off by themselves on a bench. We cadets, we just stayed together there, taking our turns to fly the Voltree vibrator. While we were watching there, maybe halfway during this period of training, this young fella turned on the final, apparently pulled the stick back because that airplane nosed right into the ground and killed him. Well, the aftermath of that is that the 4 officers resigned right then. The training program said they didn't want to fly. But I continued flying, and one day while I was in basic there, it wasn't long after that, our administrative officer came from our headquarters, came out to where I was at the auxiliary field in a staff car, called me by name. I went over, he said, "Your father is real ill. I'm going to take you, and you go back and get your clothes, and we're going to put you on a train for you to go home." So we hurried back to the base where I grabbed some clothes and a suitcase, and he gave me $20, and we went down to the depot, and the train was just pulling out, just starting to roll. Well, we jumped in his car and raced to the next town, and which was Pyote, I think it was. And it was funny going, we paralleled that railroad track, this road did, and we raced alongside that train to the next stop. And I got off, and he says, "Now you run right up, get on the train, and you can buy a ticket on the train." So I went home, where I found my father was very seriously ill with cancer. I stayed home for a week, and then I went back. And that held me back a class to 43F, because I entered an E, and so I was now an F. And these letters indicate the month. And so then I moved on to advanced training at Stockton, California, and my father died, and so I took another emergency leave and went home and was there for the funeral. That held me back to 43G, and I finally graduated at Stockton, California, flying a twin-engine Avro Anson fabric-covered airplane made up in Canada, kind of like a kite. Well, I was hoping in advance there, flying twin-engine, that I would fly P-38s, because only being 5'8", I thought that would suit me fine. But I ended up being assigned to fly B-17s. So I entered the training program for B-17s after I'd graduated from advanced flying school at Stockton, California in July 1943. And so this period of training for the B-17 was about 4 months long. We went to the state of Washington, we got our crew together, and then we went to Kearney, Nebraska for further advanced training in the B-17. And then we went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey on the train to take the Queen Mary to England.
Now, wait a minute, before we go on to England, where were you at in the state of Washington? What town was that, or what base?
Well, that was up near Moses Lake.
Okay, and that was just a brief period of time that you were there. Yeah. And you already knew how to fly, so they just kind of taught you the sequence of the checklist for the B-17, basically.
Right.
And had you gotten to be as a crew yet, or?
The crews, they put the crew together up there.
Okay. And how did they pick them?
Huh?
Were there guys that washed out a pilot that were your, like, bombardier and that sort of thing?
Well, not that I recognized.
Okay.
But a lot of the pilots, washouts, went on to navigator school or bombardier school and became second lieutenants that way.
Sure.
I want to say an interesting thing. When I was in advance, about a week before graduation, the administrative officer called us together in the gym and says, "Now we're going to graduate you men, give you a pair of silver wings, but some of you will not be second lieutenants." Well, we looked at each other and thought, "Well, what are we going to be?" He says, "You're going to be flight officers." Well, what's that? We never heard of a flight officer. Well, that's kind of like a warrant officer.
Mm-hmm.
That's one step below a second lieutenant. And you have a gold and blue bar to wear on your shoulder. And you will wear an officer's cap, but you will not be a second lieutenant. Well, we just wondered and kind of worried about that because we all wanted to be second lieutenants. Well, on graduation day, they called the names. We step up, get our diploma, our silver wings, and some fellas got the blue bars, and the rest of us, we got got gold bars, became second lieutenants. But that was kind of a shock to our class because we were the first class that happened to. But then, at that same time, the military had a training program for sergeants, and they were graduating sergeants as pilots.
Wow.
And so I'm sure they could do the job equally well, but they were still sergeants and had to work their way up to become a lieutenant and an officer.
Pretty interesting.
Well, we went through this B-17 training program, and while we were at Camp Kilmer, it was kind of interesting there because the training program was pretty severe, you might say, or hard. It kept us busy most of the time. There was a lot to learn in a short space of time. But when we got off for the weekend, we wanted to make the most of it. So 2 or 3 of us would go down to the depot and wait for the train to come in, the passenger train, and we'd get in. And of course the passenger train was full, but the conductor was good and let us ride in the dining car. It's usually about 6 in the evening, and we'd go into Omaha. And then when we get to Omaha, we always headed for one place. That was the Hill Hotel, and they had a bar underneath called the Cave Under the Hill. And so we lieutenants, we'd go down to the Cave Under the Hill there, where we hoped the pretty young girls of Omaha would come down and dance with us. And so that's what we did on weekends, and then we'd catch a train and go back to Camp Kilmer, or back down to Kilmer, Nebraska, or Kearney, Nebraska, excuse me, Kearney, Nebraska, and get with our crew and continue training. But that was kind of an interesting interlude in our training program, going to the Cave Under the Hill down in Omaha. Well, we went to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, waiting for the Queen Mary to go to England. And we were there for a period of time, and so some of us decided we'd go into New York City. And so we went in there and saw the city, and of course everywhere we went, why, people were very good to us and wanted to buy us a drink or buy us a meal or entertain us some way or other. So we had a real fine time in New York City, and that was my first experience in New York. And for a young second lieutenant, that was really good. Then the time came and we got in file and marched down to the dock and onto the Queen Mary. And of course they had the thing rigged up. I think normally in peacetime they had about 1,700 passengers, but I think at that time they had about 5,000 or 6,000 of us on the ship. And there's no chance of it sinking because it's an awful big ship.
Yeah.
But each stateroom had lovely beds in there, but they also nailed in a lot of cots and bunk beds and things like that. Every nook and cranny had a bunk bed for us, we fellows, to sleep on. But that was a 4-day trip to England, and as the Queen Mary tried to dodge all of the submarines, and they were able to do that.
They zigzagged all the way across.
Yes, they did. They zigzagged all across.
Okay.
And
so where did you go
fortunately,
to?
we evaded all of the German submarines.
Where did you end up at?
We docked in then at the Firth of Clyde up in Scotland.
Okay.
And we got off there, and we didn't see a whole lot of Scotland, of course, but we boarded a train there and went down into England, and I was very fortunate to be assigned, our crew was assigned to Bassingbourn, which is near Cambridge. And that was the deluxe air base for the Americans. It was a former first-rate base for the RAF, and that was the first base that the United States had in England, and we rented that from the English people, and they let us have that. And so we moved in, and I had a private room in the BOQ, really nice quarters, right by the officers' club, right by the dining hall. And we had first-class facilities there, whereas a lot of crews had to go out and they lived in Nissen huts and places that weren't near as nice as what we had.
Yeah.
Our training there continued, and then we started having, after we had our practice flights and so forth, we started flying missions. They'd roll us out about 4 in the morning, and we'd go down for eat, then we'd go to briefing, and then we'd go to our airplanes and take off and fly over Germany on the assigned mission. And these missions, we'd fly up about 25,000 feet, hopefully above the 88 millimeter flak, which topped out about 18,000. But the Germans would shoot it up anyway and just looked like a black cloud. There was so much of it in the air. And we knew we didn't want to get close to that because they just tear holes in everything.
Yeah.
But I started my missions then with the crew of 10. There were 10 of us on the crew. I was a co-pilot, and James Considine was the pilot. And we had then the 8 crew members who were gunners, along with the navigator, 8 enlisted men and 4 officers. Excuse me, 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. There were 10 on the crew.
And you were flying B-17s?
And we were flying B-17s, had a navigator, and
What model were you flying?
it was a Model E, and then we soon got an F. And so I was flying missions, and we'd come back then, get back about 4 in the evening, and that was about time for you to get all cleaned up, catch the truck, and go into Cambridge to dance.
Okay, now, was the plane that you first started flying a used plane, or was it and they rotated a crew out, or was it a shot-up plane, or was it a brand new plane, the E?
We used started flying in a used airplane, and then we were assigned one. And we had this plane, it was an F, and it was a much improved airplane. And then we flew Jack the Ripper, which was very famous. It was the first B-17 to go to England from the United States.
How do you mean? You mean they actually flew across?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Jack the Ripper was a very famous airplane. Like I say, it was the first B-17 that the military took to England to bomb the Germans.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And
Wow.
it'd been there since the very first, and had been on lots and lots of missions with different crews. I believe 2 different crews finished their 25 missions, which was a required amount.
Yeah.
If you could live that long, you got to come back to the States.
Sure.
But I believe 2 crews finished their missions.
And what model was it? Jack
It was
the Ripper?
an F.
It was an F.
And
Wow.
no, it was an E. Excuse me, it was an
Okay.
E model.
So you
And
got Jack the Ripper.
they were more difficult to fly.
Yeah.
And
So how many,
anyway,
how many missions
we
did you
come
do?
down and flew our missions, and at that time we did not have fighter escort.
Oh.
And then we got some fighter escorts part way on the mission.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the mission we'd fly without fighter escorts. And of course that's when all would break loose and we'd get shot at by
Okay.
many fighters.
Now, what were these day missions, and what were you bombing?
We were flying day missions every day. We didn't fly night missions.
Yeah.
The English bombers, they flew nights. But the Americans flew day missions.
And that's the most dangerous mission ever. I mean, it's more dangerous because they can see you and just pull you right out of the air. And
Yes.
What were you
Well,
bombing?
The Americans were losing an awful lot of airplanes. They lost 60 the day I got shot down.
Yeah.
A few months before was a big raid on Swineford, and they lost 60 that day. But we just lost airplanes almost every mission.
Yeah.
And I don't have the figures right in front of me right now how many we lost,
That's good.
but several hundred airplanes.
What were you shooting? What were you bombing?
Hmm?
What were your targets?
Well, we were going to, the day we got shot down, we were going to Oschersleben, which is a ball bearing plant and a very important plant.
Mm-hmm.
But we bombed all kinds of factories, and we bombed the sub-pens up on the coast.
Yeah.
And we had a few milk runs where we'd bomb a few airfields. And but normally the missions I flew on were max efforts, where they'd put hundreds of B-17s in the air. And so it was on the fateful day, that the 22nd of February 1944, that we should have stayed home that day. But everything got to going good. Even Jack the Ripper seemed to be flying good that day. This old airplane had been in the junkyard twice. And the colonel says, we just can't let that old plane be in the junkyard. It's too important. It's historic. It's famous. We got to take it out. And they'd put patches on the patches and get the thing to going again. So we were flying Jack the Ripper, and we were flying along in formation, and things seemed to be pretty good. And I noticed off to the left, it looked like a bunch of bees out there about half a mile away. It didn't seem to be a formation or anything, just looked like a bunch of bees. And I knew what they were. They were German fighter planes, and there were a lot of them. And so they were at our altitude, and they were flying our airspeed. And so about that time, everybody was alerted about it. And we saw them, puffs of smoke come out their exhaust pipes, which would indicate they'd given up the throttle.
Yeah.
And we could see them race ahead then. They sort of got in trail formation, and they went clear way out in front of us, and then they came in head on. And I sure think those German pilots were brave, because someone said on a max effort where we had these hundreds of E-17s, 1,100 guns could be concentrated on the fighter at one time.
Wow.
But they'd come in rolling, just like that, see?
Yeah.
And their their guns are flashing, and then they'd roll. If they didn't get blown up, they'd roll under your wing or on top of you, and away they'd go.
Sure.
But our gunners were good, and they'd shoot a lot of them down. And so finally they knocked out an engine on us, but we weren't the first to go. There were several other airplanes that were shot down ahead of us. But every time, you know, a plane drops out of formation, the other planes tuck right in real close. You stick that wing right in the other guy's doorway or window almost, and you fly in tight as you can. But finally, we had a couple of airplanes, or a couple of engines shot out, and we just couldn't keep up. So we salvoed the bombs.
What's
and
that
then
mean?
Even with that loss of weight, we just couldn't keep up. So we had to decide what to do. To just trail along would be death itself. But I looked down below, and there's a big cloud formation.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a few thousand feet below us. We were at that time about 23,000 feet. So I suggested that we dive down and get in that cloud formation. It was a big stratiform cloud, looked like it was thick, and stay in that and head back to England. So we did. We were fortunate. We got down, and we got into the cloud formation, and we were flying along, and we were feeling quite pleased about ourselves for having done that. And then all of a sudden we popped out. Here was a great huge hole in the clouds, and then the decision to make where to hurry across the hole or to make a sharp left turn and go around the edge of it and stay in the clouds. Because periodically we'd pull the plane up when we were in the stratiform clouds, and we, peeking our head out, we could see a fighter here and there and duck back down in the clouds. But anyway, we decided to hurry across the hole, and of course that was unfortunate because the ground ACACs started opening up on us, and they shot us full of holes and shot the airplane was filled with fire, and we just had to go. So the order was given, out we went, and we all got out except Schaub, Henry Schaub, who was killed with flak, and Jack Reimers, the bombardier, bailed out of the nose, leaving Henry in the nose, and the rest of us all bailed out. I think almost every crew member had some wounds. I was wounded in the legs, but some of them were more serious than others. We were bailed out, and
You got wounded. Most of them got wounded with gunfire, with flak. And you had some wounds on your leg from the flak.
yes.
Wow. So how did you get out of the plane?
So we bailed out the escape hatch
Where's that at?
down underneath. Yeah.
Between the two
Yeah.
pilots,
Yeah, you get out and go down.
right below you.
Yeah, right below us.
And were you the last guy out?
Well, I couldn't say
But you think you
because
were?
I couldn't see the gunners in the back. How they were.
Yeah.
They were on the interphone saying we're bailing out. See.
Did you hit the alarm? Did someone hit the alarm to get him out, or did they just say we're out of here?
Yeah, we over the interphone said bail out. You know.
And that came from
They
the
all
captain.
they all knew that anyway.
Sure. And the captain told them to do that.
And
Right?
the engineer helped the ball turret gunner get out of his ball. You know. And
Yep.
So, yeah, we were ready.
Okay.
But the ball turret gunner had got out earlier.
Sure.
Not much earlier, but some earlier.
Yeah.
Because we knew that we couldn't make it, you know.
So what happened?
So, well, we bailed out, and at the time, I was about 4,000 feet up in the air. And I just couldn't believe how quiet it was. There wasn't a sound, no sound anywhere. And I didn't know that there was so much sound on the ground, you know, of the trees and the animals and the birds and things. But anyway, I hit the ground. There were patches of snow here and there. And I would say the temperature was probably about 32 degrees. And so I grabbed my chute after and drug it over and put it on a snow pile so it wouldn't be so obvious.
Okay. Let's wait there.
Okay, after I hid my chute, I evaded for 3 days, and during which time I slept in barns and drank water from the creek, but I didn't have any food. But when I turned myself in, then finally at a railroad station there, I got in the hands of the German military, and they were very good to me. And then my transporting myself, when I was being transported, I ran into civilians. They all wanted to know if I knew their uncle in Chicago or their brother in St. Louis, and I never felt any fear at all from any of the Germans. But I ended up in Stalag Luft 1, which was up on the Baltic. And it was nothing but American Air Force officers, and 2 barracks filled with British officers that were taken at Dunkirk. And as the planes got shot down, the camp was expanded till we had several thousand there at that camp. We only had 2 formations a day, which were required. That was roll call at 9 in the morning, about 4 in the afternoon. The rest of the time, the fellows did just what they wanted to do. And the Red Cross and different organizations was very good to us to supply us Red Cross parcels, band instruments, clothing, books, everything that we needed, cards for games. And there were ball games almost every day. Some men played bridge every day. Some fellows just read a book every day. But the time passed pretty fast, and as young people, we rolled with the punches, and things were not all that bad. At times, things got a little short on food because the Americans would shoot up the trains that had the Red Cross parcels. But we made out, as young fellows, okay. There was 30 to a room, and that was interesting. We all had to take turns doing the work. But I finally I became a trader, and I traded different things with the fellas. A fella would get a sweater from home, and he wanted cigarettes, so I'd give him cigarettes for the sweater, and then I'd sell the sweater for cigarettes. Cigarettes were the medium of exchange. So eventually I became pretty wealthy, and I hired my kitchen work done and things like that. But interesting, the fellows all had great hopes about the war coming to an end. Yes, we did dig some tunnels, but there wasn't much enthusiasm for it because we all thought the war was going to end. Just like in World War One, as soon as the Allies hit the German border, the Germans capitulated and that ended the war. And we thought Hitler would end as soon as we got into France. But the fellows were all saying, well, it's going to end, the war will soon be over. But this one fellow says, well, I'll kiss your ass if it isn't over by Christmas. The other guy says, I'll take your bet right now. So the time passed and the war was not over. So it was a funny thing that young people do, you know. We all went out to the parade ground, the ball field. It was snowing, it was cold, and we had the kisser and the kissee there. And so each man had his seconds. We had a fellow that said he was a medical man. He was going to do the inspecting. So the fellow had to drop his pants, and then they had to sanitize the area, see, with snowballs. And the poor fellow, the kissee, was in misery. And the guys, you know, all young fellows just laughing and clapping and carrying on like crazy. Finally the time came, you know, and the seconds pronounced it was time to act. So the kisser reached over and kissed him, you know, on the butt. And he jerked his pants up right quick, you know, and went to the barracks to get warmed up. But you can imagine all these young fellas, you know, how they have a big time, whatever they're doing. But the war didn't end until May, and one evening, the Germans came around and closed the shutters as they did every night. And it was about time for lights out then. And soon thereafter, we heard a lot of commotion outside the windows. And the dogs were barking and the men were running here and there. And finally the word came in the room, you fellas are free to go. The Germans are all leaving. The Russians are coming. And we're free to go with the German guards over to the Americans. It said we had about 10 Russian prisoners of war that did the sanitation work around the camp and repaired fences and things. And they were going to go with the Germans because they said they'd be killed if the Russians caught them there.
Wow.
So anyway, the colonel sent the word around, no one is to leave camp. So we stayed there then, and the next thing we knew, there was a whole bunch of pretty young women coming down the road from town. And they came up to the gates, and of course the colonel says they're not going to tear the fences down, we're going to leave the gates closed. And these girls all came down the road and they were crying and saying the Russians were raping them in town and killing people. The town was about 5 miles just straight east of us. And so the colonel says we cannot let them in. And the fellows, of course, all wanted these young girls to come in and they'd protect them, you know. But the colonel says, no, we can't do that. I've had orders from England. We're to stay right here to be picked up by the B-17s,
Okay.
because there was an airfield next to us.
Oh,
And
I want to interrupt, and I want you to tell me more about what happened at your camp, because I mean you guys had tunneling, and did you also have a radio, and did you stay informed that way?
yes, we there were some radios in camp. The Germans did not have good tobacco, and they really liked American cigarettes, and so we would give them one once in a while for something. Now, trading with the Germans was strictly verboten, forbidden. Only certain men who had great knowledge of the German language and were appointed by the camp commander could talk to the German guards.
Sure.
The rest of us were not allowed to even talk to them.
Wow.
And so, for example, a guard would come around, you know, inspecting, and the appointed man would go up and say, you know, I'll give you 2 cigarettes for a toothbrush. Okay, so he'd hide a toothbrush and bring it in and get 2 cigarettes. And then the next thing you'd want would be something else. Next thing you know, you want a radio tube. Next thing you want a radio condenser.
If they refused, what would you do to them? If they refused to get the radio tube, you guys would do
Well, if
something.
they'd say, no, I can't do that, say, well, we'll just tell the base commander or your camp commander that you've been trading with us. And they'll send you off to the Russian front. So so they had to go along with it.
Yeah.
So because of that, while we did have radios, we could hear BBC
Mhm.
tell where the front was, and every room had a map of Europe.
Yep.
And on there was pins and string showing where the front was. And every day the guards would come in the rooms to look at the map because they said the German news did not tell them where the front was.
And so you were more accurate.
For example, they might say our lines were drawn to Neerman for defensive purposes. You see what I mean?
Sure.
And we draw the line and we say that's 10 miles past Cologne. They never even mentioned Cologne, you know?
Sure.
Or these other cities, they wouldn't even mention them.
So you guys were more accurate than the German radio.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. And now, what did you do in camp also to make money, to make more cigarettes? Didn't you?
Oh, well, I also was a barber,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'd cut hair for 1 cigarette.
Yeah.
And so I guess I was kind of enterprising, but anyway.
And you made a lot of cigarettes that way because
Yeah,
everyone needed a haircut.
I ended up with lots of cigarettes. I tried to get a corner on the soap market because you can't imagine how terrible it is to be without soap.
Yep.
And the soap market was getting good, you know, it was getting scarce, and I was getting this soap and I was making money hand over fist, you know.
Yeah.
And so finally the Red Cross brought in a train load of soap.
Now,
So that ruined my market there. But that's okay.
Now, what was it like in camp? Did you guys have a band and all sorts of other things? A glee
Oh,
club?
we had a good symphony.
Mhm.
We had a dance band.
Mhm.
We put on floor shows. Some of the baby-faced boys that didn't have any hair on their face, we'd shave their legs, and they'd be the girls in the chorus line. Oh, we put on some great shows. We had some of these fellas that had written shows in New York or worked on them.
Mm-hmm.
We had all manner of talent,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in camp.
Sure. And painters too.
And yes, and we had scenery, and we were able to get this the things we needed
Mhm.
through the Red Cross.
Wow.
And
So life was pretty upbeat. It wasn't really horrible. I mean, it wasn't. It wasn't a torturous time.
no, an interesting thing. One day, there was a man at the gate in civilian clothes, a big, husky-looking fella. And the fellas down at the gate walked over, you know, and he said, "Hi, men," you know, in broken English. "Hi." And so we started crowding around. It was Max Schmeling, the fighter. He'd been over here, you know, and he knocked Joe Louis out, and then Joe Louis came back and about killed him. But anyway, Jack Schmeling was there, and so they opened the gate, and he came in, and the fellow Americans were pretty reluctant at first, you know, to warm up to him. But finally, boy, everybody's wanting to shake his hand, and he loafed around there for quite a while. He was a PR man for the Germans, you know. He wasn't in the military.
Sure.
And so we shook his hand. And that was an interesting thing that day.
Now, something else happened at the gate. You talked to some fighters at the gate that were
Well,
Germans.
while I was in prison camp, occasionally the German fighter pilots would come over from the fighter base, which was maybe a half a mile away, and stand along the fence and talk to us. And you'd be surprised how many Americans knew some German. And some of the Americans had never spoke English till they was 10 years old. You know, they live in German communities around the United States. I know Radicke next door was from Dakota. And the German says, "You're from Hamburg." No, Radicke says, "I'm not from Hamburg. I'm from North Dakota." But anyway, that's the way it was. And so the German pilots would talk to us about their missions. He said, "You guys have it good. For you, the war is over. But for us, we'll fly till we die." He says, "That's the way it is. We go up and attack. If we live, we come back and refuel and go again." He said it time and time again. And they told us in England when we was flying missions that the fighter pilots were getting younger and younger with less training and less training, see?
Yeah.
And so it was sort of pathetic. But they were a fine bunch of young men, you know,
Sure.
just doing what they were told to do.
Who was your camp commander?
Well, Zemke was quite a bit of the time.
What's his name?
Huber Zemke,
Yes. And he's an Aviation Hall of Fame member now?
yeah, it is.
And sometimes you got to go up to swim at the Baltic Sea, is that right?
Yes, we had one of our German commanders was a big, tall, good-looking fella, and he was over here in the States in the 30s, laying out airfields for Pan Am. And his two boys were born over here. He used to come and take a bunch of us. We'd go up maybe a half or three-quarters of a mile to the Baltic, you know, on a hot summer day,
Sure.
and go swimming. And we didn't have any guards or no guns or anything. We just go up there because we liked him, you know what I mean? And that funny, he just took us out of camp and says, come on, let's go swimming.
That's nice.
And we go up there and swim. But he says, I hope my sons have enough sense to declare American citizenship. Because he says they can since they were born in the States.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But he wasn't a commander too long. And
Now, what happened after you, the camp's liberated, but you guys stayed in town, in the camp, until someone came by?
yeah, we were there then. And Zemke says you can't go, you have to stay here and wait on the Americans. But the Russians wouldn't let the Americans land for several days. And the Russian army came and just scared the heck out of us. They were a dirty looking bunch of Mongols, and women and men both,
Yeah.
and shooting off their guns, and they would throw these hand grenades around, you know, just to listen to them bang.
So tell me what happened. You're zipping out of camp now. You just went out. You waited till the Americans came, right?
So the Russians came in, took over, and told Zemke, pulled out their gun, said, tell them to tear the fences down. You're no longer in prison.
Yeah.
And so the fences, some of them got tore down. And then the Russian says you have to wear black armbands. Everybody has to wear a black armband because Roosevelt died. So we all had to wear a black armband. And then they said, come on, you're going to go to town, have fun. And so now these were all Russian enlisted men,
Mm-hmm.
no officers.
Okay. That's good. So I'm going to take a break here real quick.
The B-17s from my home base at Bassingbourn, England, came to fly us out of Germany back to Bassingbourn, back to Camp Lucky Strike in France on our way home. I had a little brief look around in France and London before coming home, and then went to my base up at Cambridge. And then I came home and I got in the training command, and then I was an instructor there. And I was called in on a special mission to Holland to work on the Lend-Lease program that we'd given them a lot of stuff. And at that time I was also called on a secret mission down to Frankfurt, where I worked with some pilots, German pilots from World War II, and some of them had scars of the battle, to work out for an early Air Force for the Luftwaffe. I came back to the States, and then I started flying B-52s after the University of Michigan. And I flew the B-52s in Altus, Oklahoma, and in Dayton, Ohio.
Yep.
And then after that, I got into as a commander of the missile outfit. I retired in 1964 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with 24 years active duty. I stayed in this area. My wife, Frances, who I married from my hometown, we liked living here near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I want to say this in closing, that a person makes their own breaks. And so, have a good time, and I hope you enjoy it.
Okay. Now, when you were doing that secret mission over in Frankfurt, that was a hush-hush mission. It was
Yeah.
pretty top secret.
Yeah, I mentioned that.
Okay, and so that was you got a commendation from the State Department for that, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay, and what year did you get married?
We got married in 1946.
And that was before you flew B-52s.
Right.
Okay, and
We now live at 4777 Upper Valley Road, Dayton, Ohio, 45424, phone 937-878-5116. Call us anytime.
okay, and how many missions did you fly B-52s? And you were flying nuclear weapons, right?
Well, I didn't keep a record how many
Okay.
flights we had.
Where were you stationed at with the 52s?
Aldous, Oklahoma, and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
When did you come to Wright-Pat?
We came to Wright-Patterson in 1960,
Okay.
summer of 1960.
And what?
The Air Force wanted to disperse the SAC units,
Sure.
and so they built an addition to the base for us, and we moved over there.
What was the name of the missile program that you worked on?
It was the Hound Dog program.
The Hound Dog missile
Yeah.
program, and you were the commander of that.
Yeah.
The directorate.
Yeah.
And what time? When did you start that?
Yeah, that was in 1943.
In 1943.
Yeah.
In 1963.
63, excuse me. Yeah.
Okay. And what do you do in your spare time now?
Well, I raise Clydesdale horses. I'm the oldest breeder of Clydesdale horses in the state of Ohio. And I collect antique tractors and restore those, and belong to a lot of the veterans organizations.
Okay. And you're also active in the Greene County Republican Party.
I'm a Republican in the party and a Shriner. So you see, I'm a joiner.
You like to do things.
Come visit.
Well, that's good. And how many children do you have?
I have 2 children, Steve and Susan.
Okay. And I'm glad you could serve our country, and we're really proud that you did. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, but people do what they have to do to get the job done. No criticism, because everybody would do the same thing if they had that same job to do with the same facilities and the same background. I think they'd do the same thing.
Well, so it's a pleasure talking to a real American hero. Thank you, Colonel Stuckey.
Thank you.